So a while back, some people on Patreon asked me if I would be willing to share my book recommendations for things like corset making and pattern making and just sewing in general. So I thought I would go through some of my favorite books that are like Bibles to me. A lot of these I feel like I've only really been introduced to them from going to school, so maybe this information isn't like super groundbreaking secret knowledge or anything, but if you didn't go to school for fashion and don't really know where to begin, then sometimes I feel like it's helpful to see recommendations from people who did go to those courses or who actually have used these books and can kind of give like a real world recommendation about them. So this is going to be a mix of sewing related books and pattern making and costuming and corset specific books. So let's get started. So the first book here, this is kind of like the Bible of sewing techniques. This version is pretty old, but sewing techniques don't really change over time. So I have taken classes and then I've gone back as more of a tutor and seen people still using these books, and I feel like it kind of just holds up over time. And granted, like a lot of these techniques you can learn from YouTube or from blogs online, but at least for my learning style, I feel like it's really helpful to have step-by-step instructions and pictures that I can see and go back to and not have to pause the video or remember where I found that one blog. It's just all in one spot. So I'll still reference this sometimes for certain techniques, like here's some great like pocket tutorials on like the proper way to reinforce pockets, and it has some like tailoring examples in here. And it just kind of goes through like the proper way to do everything. Like maybe you don't know the proper way how to sew a button. Or it has like pattern cutting instructions, stuff like that. This is really basic sewing information, but if you're new to sewing and don't know where to begin and just kind of want a great resource that is, you know, apocalypse proof, then this is the thing that you need to have. I will put links to this book and all the other books I mentioned in the description as well. Also on the topic of sewing is tailoring. So I have two books here that I would recommend. These are really specifically about tailoring techniques. So if you wanted to make a coat or a jacket or a suit or something, then these would be the great resources to have, because they don't really always touch on those details in just like a basic sewing book. I've mentioned this before in a previous video, this book, but it just kind of walks you through all the different steps that you need for creating like a perfectly tailored garment. And I refer to this one a lot, especially when I'm doing pockets, like a welt pocket or something, because those can be pretty tricky to construct, and if you do one step wrong, then it could mess everything up. So it also has great resources for shaping jackets for tailoring. So if you've never made a jacket before, there's tons of like internal structure that goes on in a jacket that is really important to give it that like beautiful clean roll, like in the collars and stuff. So this book goes through like all the different hand stitches that you need to do and all the different materials that they recommend. And I really don't do that much tailoring, but when you do, it's sort of like a totally different technique. So this is a great resource to have if you plan on making a coat or something like that. This is like the right way to do it. And on that same note, there's also this book, Easy, Easier, Easiest Tailoring, which I really, really love. It's not quite as comprehensive as the book that I just showed you, but it is like a really simple guide to different tailoring techniques. And as the title says, it shows you 3 different ways to do the same technique: the easy way, the easier way, and the easiest way. And the easy way, granted, is the hardest way. But the easiest way is sort of like what they would do in a fast fashion or like a mass manufactured tailored item. And the easy, or what I think is the hard way, is like the very nice, right way to do it. Actually, maybe this book would be like the hard way, and maybe this version is slightly easier, but I think they're kind of the same. But it just goes through different techniques. Like I showed you in that previous book, the different hand stitches that you would do to get like a beautiful roll on a collar. Well, this book would show you like how to do the same thing but with a machine stitch, and it will also show you like the hand stitching way, but it tells you the areas where you can cheat and you can modify things to make it faster, and it tells you the areas where you really can't cheat. And I love that as a person who sews, because I'm always looking for making things the most time efficient, but I still don't want to compromise on the way it looks at all. So this is kind of fun to see the experts telling you like, okay, it's okay to cut corners here, or this is where you really don't want to cut corners. And they also explain like what result you're going to end up with if you do the machine stitching versus the hand stitching and stuff like that. So if you're into tailoring, definitely pick this one up as well. Next, this is not really related to sewing. This is more about fashion illustration. This is the textbook that I went through in my fashion illustration class, and granted, my fashion illustration skills aren't very good anymore, but when I was taking this class, they were definitely better, because the main thing that I loved about this book is you just kind of go through and practice drawing the same thing in a bunch of different variations. So I think it is more like a real drawing class where you're doing like a study of different angles and lighting and such, but specifically for fashion. And so I remember there's like a chapter in here where we drew nothing but hands for like a week, and it gives you inspiration for how to draw those things. It also goes through how to draw different types of fabric, like how they would weigh differently, and also how you would do like the shading on something that's a velvet versus something that's satin. Like those are going to be very different highlights and coloring techniques as well. And this really just kind of forces you to practice a lot and to draw like really complicated garments. And it's just a great resource if you're like, how do I draw a skirt with these cascades on it, or with like a ruching in the center back? And these things can be kind of complicated, and if you don't have like a real example of something to look at, then just looking at a picture of that dress online isn't going to be the same, because it's not going to translate it correctly. And like here's also how to draw like patterns and knits and stuff like that. And it's just a fabulous resource. I think this one is a little bit expensive. It is like your standard school textbook, so you can expect those kind of prices, but it's spiral bound, it's hardcover, it's just a great resource to have. And I did sell a lot of my textbooks after my classes in college, but this is one that I definitely wanted to hold on to. Next in the general books that I recommend is this draping book. So a lot of people haven't really taken a draping class unless they've gone to school for it, and it's kind of a confusing thing to learn. I feel like this book does go through each step pretty well on how to prepare your fabric, and it just takes you through different design concepts. And draping takes a lot of practice, but once you sort of know the basics, you get to start playing around with things. And to be honest, I haven't worked with any other draping books, so I don't know if there's any better ones out there, but I used this one in school, and it really taught me how to drape. And now draping is, I wouldn't say it's my favorite method, but I do really love draping things when I'm feeling a little bit lazy about doing pattern making. And on that note, on to pattern making. So this is Helen Joseph Armstrong's Pattern Making for Fashion Design. This is my Bible when it comes to pattern making. I still use this all the time. This will take you from the very beginning of drafting your own pattern block from your measurements so that you have a pattern that actually works for you, and then doing a fitting on that, and then doing various types of pattern making techniques using different methods to achieve a bunch of different styles. And it goes from everything from blouses, dresses, skirts. It does women's wear, it does men's wear, it even does some children's wear. I believe. And it teaches you how to knock off different garments. If you have like a pair of pants that you really love, but you don't have the pattern for it, you want to replicate it, it teaches you how to do that. It also teaches you how to do like swimwear and activewear and knits, and it's really comprehensive. I know that there are some errors in this book from when I went through it in school, so my instructor walked us through those errors, but maybe there's a newer edition now that doesn't have those. This is the 5th edition that I'm working with, so hopefully maybe there is an updated edition. But regardless, even with the errors, I found this book very helpful and still use it to this day. So if you are trying to get into pattern making and maybe you are taking a class at the same time, or you're just watching video tutorials, or you just want to jump in and try to learn it yourself, this is where I would recommend starting. And now moving on to more specific types of pattern making, these would be more of what I would recommend if you already have pattern making experience. Definitely not books that you would learn pattern making from, but if you already know the basics and you want to start doing very niche specific things that basic books won't cover, then these have got you covered. So for corset making, this is a great resource that covers a lot of different styles of corsets. It does half bone stays, I believe it does full bone stays, it does underbust corsets, it does bodices, it does riding corsets, Swiss waists, pretty much everything that you could want. I don't know if it does a mid-bust corset. There is a time frame in here. Let's see if I can find it. So it looks like it goes from patterns from 1735 to 1890. So that does cover Victorian era, and it is chronological as well, which is fun to just kind of look and see the progression of different styles as you go along. And there's beautiful pictures of extant garments, which are just fun to look at. So this will tell you how to draft these patterns from scratch. And I think that a lot of these are based off of Janet Arnold's books, which I will get to next, but it's a little bit more digestible than those. It kind of spells it out for you in more of a modern way, or walks you through it a little bit more, how to draft the pattern. So if you're really interested in patterning corsets, then I really recommend starting here. Now, as I just mentioned, the Janet Arnold books they're sort of the costume maker's Bible, the Patterns of Fashion series. So I only have 2. I have Patterns of Fashion 5 and 1. 1 is 1720 to 1860 women's dresses, and then 5 is specifically for undergarments. Doesn't include chemises, but corsets and hoops and rumps. So both of these books, they do require a little bit more work than like the previous book I just showed you, because they give you the patterns on a grid. Here we have a dress like this, and this is what the pattern looks like. So you have to start with these books by kind of adjusting the measurements for scale. So I think that these squares are 1 centimeter, I don't know metric, but they're small, and then you have to calculate what that would be for your measurements. So it's a little bit of a tedious process. I've done it a few times before, and it does start to click as you get the hang of it, but it's not as simple as just following instructions in a book. So these ones are a little bit more advanced, but the resource is amazing. They base these patterns off of actual historical garments, so this is like as historically accurate as you can get. And as I was saying before about having to scale the size, you're just scaling it to the size of the garment that they based the pattern off of. So you're not even making a pattern in your size necessarily, you're just making it to the full size of that historical garment. So then you have to do adjustments and alterations as well. So definitely more complicated than the other books. but it's much more comprehensive in terms of what types of costumes that you can make, and they're much more historically based than the other ones. So this is like the holy grail of costuming, and every costumer knows these books and loves them, I think. Also just has great reference photos, which I just like to look at the pictures sometimes. And I have a goal of getting all of these books at one point, but they're a little bit pricey, and these were the two most important ones for what I need. But they're generally all very good. One example of when I used this book, when I was making a collection of Rococo gowns and I wanted to make a sack back dress, so like this. Rather than going through all of this and scaling the pattern up, I found a little bit easier method, which I will talk about next. So that would be this book. This is American Duchess's Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking, and it has a few gowns in here, but it specifically has the sack back gown that I was talking about before, the sack gown. And it basically does sort of the same thing. It gives you instructions on how to scale up the pattern, but with this gown, they also sell a pattern. I want to say it's Simplicity or Butterick, one of those like big four brands. So you can just buy a pattern for this dress. You don't have to go through all this work if you want to make a sack gown or some similar type of Rococo gown. And that's what I recommend doing if you really want to make one of these gowns but don't want to take on the full like historical costumer's approach. And this book gives you instructions on how to construct the gown. I used a combination of going through this book and using the pattern. This book is supposed to be something that you can use without having the pattern if you want to construct the pattern yourself. But I really just found it helpful for the pictures and the techniques, and it does differ a little bit from the pattern instructions, I think, because it's more geared towards costume makers, and big patterns are more geared towards home sewers. So they try to make things easier, I think. But this is a little bit of a blend between the really strict historical costuming method and like the pattern, store-bought pattern home sewing method. So it doesn't just have instructions for that dress either. It also has some other great dresses in it. The English gown, and it has the Italian gown, which I really want to make next. That one is so beautiful. And it also has patterns for doing undergarments. Oh, here's another photo of the Italian gown. So it also has patterns for making undergarments like the false rump. It also has fun accessories like this ruffled chemisette, and it has how to make these little bows. There's also somewhere in here here's a pattern for a petticoat, and somewhere in here there's a pattern for a little cap. Oh, here it is, which is also really cute. So this is just a great resource to have for if you want to do anything 18th century, Rococo, that kind of thing. The people at American Duchess are experts at what they do, and I'm so glad that they try to make historical costuming more accessible to people like you and me who maybe don't have the time to dive into reconstructing an old garment and scaling up the pattern and all that stuff. So this is a great happy medium between the two. So if 18th century dressmaking is not your thing, there's also 16th century dressmaking, or this also has menswear in it, which is the main reason I got it, because it has some fun patterns for things like pumpkin pants, which I have yet to make, but I've always wanted to make. And it has patterns for doublets and anything Shakespearean that you might want to make. I think there's even like a codpiece pattern in here, which I would like to make for my partner. One day I'm going to get him like a more legit Renaissance fair outfit. And it also has like women's garments as well. So I actually have not used this book yet. I just got it, but I've been looking through it, and it looks like it should be pretty easy to understand. It's the same concept where it gives you this scaled pattern, and then you have to scale it up to size, and then you have to adjust the measurements to your own. So not quite as easy. If anything else, it's just fun to look at the pictures and imagine yourself making that kind of thing. Here's the cod piece. I believe this one also has corsets in it, like Tudor stays, if you wanted to make something like that. Oh, yeah, it's got how to make the little neck ruff, which I've always wanted to make as well. So I'm excited to dive into this one. This is like a half recommendation because I haven't actually used it yet, but I have seen the reviews, and the reviews were good, so maybe mine will be added to that. So lastly, I have what is like just a really great coffee table book to have. It's just called The Costume History. This is just a really great resource to have for inspiration for historical costuming. It goes through different outfits, costumes from so many different countries and empires and civilizations from different time periods. I believe it goes back to 400 AD. No, it goes even earlier than that. It starts at the ancient world. So I think this goes back to pretty much as far as we have costume history, which would be the Egyptians, which is really cool. It shows you basically just the same drawings that they had for fashion and lets you interpret it how you will. There is some text in here, so it's not just like totally looking at pictures, but I just got this book, so I haven't read the text yet. But it really lets you interpret it for yourself. So this artist that created this book made it back in the 19th century. I think he was either Italian or French, but he did a great work for the costuming community, really. And there's even like pictures of tools that they had. This guy, I think he basically just went through all the historical fashion resources that existed at the time and compiled them into one book. And mostly that's through like fashion plates, but I'm sure he had some other resource materials to reference. And he just compiled it all into one spot. And it's really cool because it goes into countries that we don't normally see fashion history from. Like, here's some illustrations from India, and there's also like Ottoman Empire and Africa and Turkey. So like Western fashion history doesn't always touch on those things. And granted, I don't think that the Eastern civilizations are very comprehensive, but that is just sort of a failing of fashion history in general. It doesn't cover those as well. European fashion tends to be more of the focus, which is a shame because there's such beautiful fashion in Eastern fashion, but I digress. Here's Russian fashion history, and it's just so fun because it's things that you don't really normally see on like the 5 pictures that come up on Pinterest when you look for like historical fashion inspiration. So I just really love this resource, and I don't think it was too expensive either. Makes a great birthday present, even just for yourself. If you love fashion history, then you definitely are going to want this at some point in your life. So that's it for my recommendations. I hope you found this helpful. I do regret that it might be a bit limited to my experience, but you know, I think these books are pretty popular, and if you've been seeing other people talk about them, then maybe this will help give you the push. And if you have any questions specifically about these books, then I'm happy to answer them if I can. If you have any experience with these books or any complaints, or you just want to contribute your review, then be sure to leave that in the comments as well so other people can read it. That's it for my book recommendations. Until next time.